Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies. As we continue with Part 10, the Nursery School of Humanism, from the Orders of Universal Reformation, by Manly P. Hall. The Nursery School of Humanism. Before unfolding the cycle of the utopias, it may be well to examine somewhat critically the motives underlying the 17th century recension of esoteric philosophy. Between the years 1550 and 1650, there was an extraordinary revival of interest in obscure arts and sciences. This revival included the rescuing of many ancient authors from comparative obscurity, extensive revisions of earlier texts, elaborate commentaries on older works, and a number of original productions. These were distinguished for their extravagance of their intimations and implications, and the remarkable designs and figures which often embellished their texts. While some of these productions were obviously fabricated to cater to the prevailing public taste, many were reverent, sincere, and scholarly. Numerous books and tracts which appeared during this recension dealt apparently with astrology, alchemy, magic, Kabbalism, and related fields. English authors were generously represented and shared honors with learned doctors and divines living on the continent. Most of the more impressive tomes were published at Frankfurt, Germany. Although other printing places were indicated on the title pages, the engravings which illustrated the various texts obviously belonged to one school or group of artists. As the designs frequently are without adequate description, we can conclude that the designers had a skill and insight of their own and did not depend for inspiration upon the authors whose works they illustrated. Often books were published anonymously or were signed only by initials. A goodly number were accredited to authors who have survived only as names. Some of these names are impressive in the extreme, but evidently are pseudonyms of persons determined to conceal their true identities. During this cycle, numerous volumes appeared accredited to scholars long dead. Some of these books have been proven to be ingenious forgeries with no legitimate claim to antiquity. Thus, the Cave of Zoroaster is without any foundation in Persian doctrine. Semiramis, the mythical queen of Babylon, never wrote the alchemical tract attributed to her, and we may doubt Aristotle's little book of advice to midwives, which gained considerable popularity during the 17th century. Distinguished sounding names occur, but when we learn that the mineral gluten was from the pen of a female adept, Dorothea Juliana Walakin, or that Chrysostomi Ferdinandi de Saber wrote the Practica Nature Vera, we have added little to the sum of human knowledge. The general policy of confusion and subterfuge and the repeated use of pseudonyms by well-known authors cast suspicion upon many works and strengthened the belief that a smaller group of writers was involved than is usually supported. Referring to the general concealment of authorship in England during the time of the Tudors, Edwin Johnson writes, that period was not only a time of severe repression and harsh government, but also a time when free speech was impossible. Able men could only disseminate and speak in allegory. The plays of Shakespeare and other writers are, doubtless, a reflection of the period, the names but a disguise. The playwrights merely the spokesmen of those who would have been sent to the tower and the block if they had expressed their opinions openly. A survey of the situation inclines the mind towards the belief that the general philosophical and ethical reformation was engineered by a secret confederation of intellectuals operating simultaneously and according to a general plan both in England and upon the continent. We may even suspect that the moving spirit of the entire enterprise resided in England, although a considerable part of the activities previously appeared in France, Germany, and Italy. In his literary legends, John Hutchinson makes a brief survey of the circumstances leading to the so-called revival of letters, which occurred in the 16th century. He is convinced that a great part of English literature, including Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and More's Utopia, was written considerably later than supposed, and the editions backdated. Hutchinson favors the hypothesis that a large number of books, highly controversial and inciting rebellion against the artificial limitations and restraints imposed upon learning, originated in that factory of wits, known in London as the Inns of Court. These inns were the abode of young intellectuals, many with legal training and most of them strongly opposed to existing political and educational institutions. Rare Ben Jonson describes the Inns of the Court as the noblest nurseries of humanity and liberty in the kingdom. It is quite possible that English humanism found its most vigorous exponents among the new generation of honest and earnest thinkers, with considerable leisure at their disposal and a spirit for almost any kind of adventure. When we realized that few facilities were available to check the authenticity of literary claims and pretensions, it is evident that the project was not overly hazardous. After all, even after that time, literacy was an exception rather than a rule, and the public mind had slight capacity and less interest in weighty matters. After more than 300 years, it is still difficult to find an audience for the Shakespearean plays. These immortal productions are too literary to be enjoyed by the majority of modern theater goers. It is difficult to understand how they could have been produced at all in the shoddy environments of such Elizabethan theaters as the Rose or the Globe. Not one in 100 of those attending had even heard of Caesar or Cleopatra, nor had they any interest in the delinquencies of the Plantagenets or the misfortunes of Hamlet and Lear. Their concept of comedy was distinctly baldy, and the sly jest of the great bard had nothing in common with the prevailing sense of humor. Even the titled and land gentry, whose patronage permitted the English theater to survive, would have been in a condition of complete mental exhaustion after one soliloquy. If an actor could have been found capable of memorizing the lines, we are forced to conclude that the mighty dramas were intended to be read, not played, and were for the edification of certain persons, not for the amusement of the general public. If we seek to marry the lives of the Elizabethan gentry with their supposed literary productions, we cannot but wonder how Sir Walter Raleigh, seldom distinguished for the profundity of his thinking, chanced to produce a monumental work like his History of the World, while languishing in the Tower of London. It is also a little surprising that the surviving tutors or the incumbent students enjoyed so keenly a play like Henry VIII, with its devastating implications. Someday we shall be forced to revise our concept of life and letters in Merry England in the good old days. If, however, we recognize the presence of a deep-laid scheme, nurtured in secret and bequeathed to posterity as a priceless heritage, numerous difficult compounds are immediately dissolved and the basic elements become obvious. The curious emphasis which distinguishes the late 16th and early 17th centuries as a period of incredible intellectual fertility reveals a distinct pattern of human industry. It is not enough that a new star appears in Cassiopeia. Rather, we must seek a constellation of genius, shining in a cultural firmament. The Inns of Court were the most logical headquarters of this heroic band, resolved to bring about the universal reformation of mankind. Oxford and Cambridge were the castles of intellectual feudalism. Here the sons of proud families were polished beyond their capacities, but the Inns of Court nourished a stronger brood. Here younger sons with little hope of large patrimony or hereditary honors and the sons of less opulent ancestry were preparing themselves to carve out destinies by merit and courage. Their positions and estates suited them for rebellion and some bitterness, with less to lose and more to gain by overturning institutions already tottering. These young men had the courage to dream, the fortitude to wait, and the ingenuity to plot their courses with appropriate subtlety. The intrepid band matured their projects with their lives and, as occasion permitted, attracted younger blood to their cause. Throughout its operation, these schemes revealed some of the most basic thinking ever accomplished by the human race. Those of the original group who attained high stations used their new offices to further the central project. Thus came into being an over-emperor of poets, scholars, philosophers, and mystics. The old order of learning ended, and through them a new concept of the dignity of the human estate was revealed to a long-suffering world. These humanists were the original utopians, and although their literary productions appeared under various names in far-flinging places and at different times, these apparently unrelated publications were circumscribed by one vast interest, which becomes evident as we examine these separate projects. The prominent Moravian educator, Comenius Johann Amos Kaminsky, 1592 to 1670, was convinced that public schools should be workshops of humanity and not torture chambers. He was the moving spirit behind a broad program of humanistic reform based, at least in part, upon Francis Bacon's Advancement of Learning, which appeared first in the English edition of 1605. Comenius must be included among the utopians because he was resolved to bring about a reformation of the intellectual habits of mankind. There can be no doubt, wrote Professor Laurie of the University of Edinburgh, that it was chiefly the speculations of Lord Verulam that fired the imagination of Comenius and led him to conceive of hopes of reducing all existing learning to a systematic form and providing for all the more ambitious youth of Europe in a great Pansophic college opportunities for the universal study of the whole body of science. To this universal and systematic learning he gave the name of Panasophia or Encyclopedia. From the works of Jacob Katz, Amsterdam, 1655, The Resurrection of Truth. This rare and little-known engraving shows a radiant figure raising the lid of a tomb. The stone is labeled Veritas. The panel on the wall, difficult to read in the reproduction, contains 33 letters including the numbers, and states that Truth died in 1626. The number 33 is associated with the degrees of Freemasonry and is the cipher number of Francis Bacon. The year 1626 is the supposed year of Bacon's death. This emblem relates to the resurrection of the esoteric doctrine from its secret tomb. That is, the society dedicated to its perpetuation through concealment. A little investigation reveals that Comenius had a personal acquaintance with other members of the circle of humanitists, responsible for so many advanced ideas in the various departments of learning. For example, Johann Valentin André, identified with the Rosicrucian Reformation and the author of the Utopian Romance, Christianopolis, corresponds with Comenius, writing him with words of encouragement and saying that he gladly passed on the torch to him. The highly significant year 1623, Tommaso Campanella, 1569 to 1639, the Italian Renaissance philosopher, published his contribution to the utopian scheme under the title, The City of the Sun. The ideal community, broadly speaking the result of Platonic inspiration, was ruled over by philosophical priests and, for the time in which it was written, was definitely scholastic. Comenius compared Bacon's Instauratio Magna, published in 1620, with the work of Campanella and recorded his conclusion in these words: "But when Bacon's Instauratio Magna came into my hand, a wonderful work, which I consider the most instructive philosophic work of the century now beginning, I saw in it that Campanella's demonstrations are wanting in that thoroughness which is demanded by the truth of things, because the noble Verulam, while giving the true key of nature, did not unlock her secrets, but only showed, by a few examples, how they could be unlocked, and left the rest to future observation to be extended through centuries." On at least one occasion, Comenius was the guest of the Invisible College, which had been set up in England to advance the scientific principles of Francis Bacon. He was invited by Parliament, and this august body went so far as to propose that the revenues of Chelsea College be placed at the disposal of Comenius, so that he could advance the great Panasophic scheme and create a universal college, solely devoted to the dream of Lord Vellum. But England was on the eve of open rebellion, and the government was so involved in the problem of its own survival that the project could not be consummated. Comenius was invited to Sweden, where he was instrumental in reorganizing the schools of the country. He believed in a balanced program for the training of the young, and his curriculum included arts, sciences, practical economics, languages, and handicrafts. Examples like that of Comenius reveal the bonds of common interest and purpose which existed among the prominent humanists of the time. Bacon's New Atlantis was the natural consummation and interrogation of several schemes or projects. His College of the 6 Days' Work is identical in principle with the Panasophic University of Comenius. Considerably later, William Blake, 1757 through 1823, through disagreeing with the Baconian method, conceived of a utopia based upon the mystical experience of the forgiveness of sin. Blake was of the opinion that man should not ask God to forgive their imperfections, but should establish a commonwealth in which each man forgave the sins of his fellow man, as long as the entire race shared in an inevitable tendency to fall short of the practice of virtue. There could be no permanent and benevolent social structure. Not until criticism and condemnation ceased would humanity accept naturally and honestly the burden of human imperfection. Blake was a Neoplatonist, and both his writings and his art were inspired by the political convictions of Plotinus and the dream of the final establishment of Platonopolis, the philosopher's commonwealth. The utopias, therefore, revealed their hidden purpose and the deep-laid plan, which projected them into literary form. When we accept the existence of a secret order of men dedicated to the emancipation of the human mind, from this general premise, therefore, we proceed naturally to a consideration of the machinery of secret societies responsible for the benevolent conspiracy which resulted in the emergence of the democratic way of life. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.